Good afternoon, one and all. It's just about to turn 5:45. James here at the Evelyn, and we're going to be doing some AQA A-Level Sport in Society revision this afternoon. With me to my right is the wonderful Marta Soteres-Mon.
Hello.
Part owner of this business, Spanish and French teacher, bit of a legend, and also on a diet.
Yeah.
Keto.
Yeah.
Going well?
Fantastic.
Good. Couple of reminders for everyone tonight. You should have with you your notes pages, your practice questions, your mark schemes, your model answers. They should be in your vicinity. Secondly, I want you to do me a favour. Go and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Hit that like button. It really does us a favour in terms of keeping this sort of resource for free longer term. So please do make a point of doing that. We very much appreciate you doing it. We don't want anything else out of you. Hopefully, it's a fair exchange, the amount of resources that we're providing with a bit of luck. And then before we get started, I want to remind you that we really value you asking questions here. If you're watching us on the hub page, there's a live chat there. Marta's actually going to be staffing that live chat, and we'll be bringing questions to me during the little break and at the end. Now, talking about the break, we are expecting this afternoon session to be really quite dinky, kind of a small little session. So what we're going to kind of do is we're going to front load it with a bit longer, might go 20, 25 minutes, something like that. And then the last little section where we look at the interrelationship between Sport England and partners, it's going to be a tiny, just a handful of minutes. We're estimating this session will be around about 40 minutes to 45 minutes in total. So, unless Marta tells me any different, we've already done our OCR A-Level biomechanics session tonight. We're now with you AQA guys doing Sport and Society. It just shows the breadth that A-Level P can offer, and we'll get on with the Sport and Society. Some hit, Marta, you look forward to a history of lawn, of tennis, track and field, football, 1780 to 1900. Keen?
And looking forward to receiving questions from our students who are watching this session. Remember, using the live chat on the hub page.
That's exactly what we want. Remember that like button. Let's switch over the feed. Here we go. Now, clearly, we're going to talk about industrial and post-industrial Britain here, and really, it's derived from an expectation that we're going to be asked about one of four kind of avenues or themes. Now, I mentioned one of four, and it's absolutely possible, of course, that you could get a question about the development of association football 1780 to 1900, hence all of the details that we've included here. But I'd also sort of suggest to you that you want to be considering sort of the capacity that you have to compare them. You want to be considering as well, obviously within that, looking at differences. You want to be thinking about, within this, the capacity to actually look at the general picture. And it's this last point that I want to sort of stress first, because before we look at this information at the top, I'm going to take this slightly unusual step of going all the way past it, ignoring it, and coming down to this stuff here before we look at that. And this will take us a little bit of time, actually, because we want to look at the general characteristics of industrial society, and then we want to apply them into those four themes. So first of all, I want to talk to you about urbanisation. People moved from the agrarian experience of the countryside, and they moved into rapidly growing cities. And we can call this a process of urbanisation or migration. Of course, we call this an internal migration in this sense. So people moved effectively from the countryside into the city. And that the sort of the upshot of that was that there were more people in smaller spaces. Now start to think about that with regard to what that can influence with regard to participation, with regard to spectatorship, with regards to the loss of opportunity and rights of traditional pre-industrial type sports. These are factors that people experienced during this time period. However, by the latter part of this time, we also had the notion of improved transport. So early, perhaps 1780 to 1800, with that, we had this mass migration that led to negative opportunities. But as this process continued, transport improved. And we're particularly interested, when we talk about transport, we're particularly interested in the development of rail, and much later, by the way, the development of roads. I mean, roads were significantly later than rail. There would have always been sort of roads in the sense of kind of horse and carriage type roads, but we're talking about, effectively tarmacked, smooth surfaces. This came really in the 20th century. Rail from the sort of 1830s onwards, we get the development of a national rail network. Again, start to think about what that would have meant for fixtures, for spectatorship later on in the period. that we're studying. In fact, let me actually link from there. So we're interested now in the idea of fixtures. We're interested now in the idea of spectatorship and how that was influenced by this general characteristic of society. Let's go a little bit further. We're also interested in the idea of communications, or what we'd call improved communications. So it's not just the fact that we've got a new rail network, but we've also got the notion that we've got communications developing and progressing. So a couple of things to be aware of. There was a postal service that was developed, and that might not seem very relevant, but the fact that you've got things capable of coming through your door, that you even got the sort of notion of kind of leaflet drops and marketing, this is quite important for, well, let's say, the local football team, for example. We've also got the development of the printed press, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples of where this was particularly relevant. We have a publication called the Bells Weekly, which published all sporting results by the end of the 19th century. So that's up to 1900, and that became a really popular publication. Think about it like, I suppose, think about it like the BBC Sports page of its day, or the Sky Sports page of its day, I suppose. Let's go a touch further. We have, without question, the ongoing development of the British Empire. So, in essence, the British Empire allowed the opportunity for the spread of what we're going to talk about in a second, which is the new versions of sports, the new versions of games, and we'll talk about that and where they sort of hailed from in a moment. We also have the idea of factory provision. One of the reasons that people migrated to the city was the loss of employment in the countryside due to mechanisation, and then the opportunity of work in the city where factories were sort of growing and burgeoning through this new kind of industrial process. So these are some of the factors we got. We got jobs paid poorly. Okay, so working class people did not receive a lot of compensation for what was a very, very long working week. And let me put that in there. We've got a long working week. The way this worked in a lot of cases was that people would move to the city, and they would effectively be paid, air quotes, through the provision of accommodation, these sorts of things. And the accommodation was appalling. Often tens of families in a single room with no windows, no ventilation, and an open fire. Picture that. Unbelievably savage conditions. But we've also got the idea of dangerous jobs. It wasn't like the times now where, generally speaking, people are safe at work, with a couple of exceptions, like maybe the military, but the jobs were really, really dangerous. So the idea of this is that gradually conditions improved. And that was hard fought. It did not happen immediately. And let's not think that factory owners did this out of the love of their workers. No, they did it out of a realisation that that's where productivity came from. So gradually conditions improved. And what that ultimately led to is sort of the notion of factory teams. And we've got lots of examples of factory teams. We've got West Ham, we've got Arsenal. West Ham being a tool manufacturer, Arsenal being a weapons manufacturer. These factory owners supported their workers in establishing teams, and those teams ultimately then competing in the examples I've given in football. Let's go a touch further before we go back to our actual sporting examples. I really want to talk about churches. And you might be thinking, hey, what's that got to do with it? But churches. The influence of the church was really significant, okay? And what we can say about the church is that they gradually supported, and I don't mean in sort of like the fan sense, but they gradually sort of endorsed, supported, even resourced sort of what we might call like more modern urban sport. Obviously, the pre-industrial version of sport would often be frowned upon by the church because they were very violent and rowdy and all this kind of stuff. But the other thing they did was churches are effectively landowners, so they offered use of land. So their land became actual spaces for play, whether it be rugby or football or whatever. Let's go a little bit further. We want to talk about the influence of local authorities. So think about like your local council. I'm sure that's very high on your priority list, thinking about them. But local authorities, what we're finding here is that this was an era of social reform. So we're getting the development of park spaces, of public baths. By baths, I mean what we'd call swimming pools, I suppose, today. But they used to be called baths. I used to go to the baths every Friday night as a kid when I was growing up in Carlisle. those of you from Carlisle probably know where it is. But anyway, so we've got this sort of notion here. Oh, by the way, I'm so sorry, I missed a couple of things that I wanted to say with regard to churches as well. Let me just go back here. We've got the notion here as well of the development of the Ymca, which is Young Men's Christian Association for people, this would obviously sort of be physical. We've also got the development of the Boys Brigade. It's a religious organisation, but very much allowing boys to be sort of physical and sporting in that environment. And don't forget as well, we've got the idea of Sunday school teams. And some of these went on to be really effective. Think teams like Aston Villa, for example. Now, back to our local authorities. There's a time of social reform for our local authorities. We've got the notion, as I mentioned before, of public parks, open spaces. Let's get that in and make sure that we can reference that. We've also, because we've got this social reform, it's this social reform, if I can sort of link these things together, it's the social reform that led to these gradually improving conditions down here, slightly better pay, better working conditions, and so on. Now, we've also got the influence of public schools and universities. So think about your public school boys and university students. It was these people that would leave their institutions and they'd go on and they'd form national governing bodies. They'd codify sports and alike. And really what we're talking about here is the emergence of the middle class. Remember, in pre-industrial society, the middle class hadn't really existed. There were small numbers of people in professional roles, but it was really a sort of what we'd call a feudal system. It was the landowning gentry and the workers and the lower class. By now, we've now got the emergence of the middle class through the wealth that was developed through the industrialization process, and that led to the growth of these people. So we've now got a three-tier system, a three-tier class system. Now, last couple of points. These people, I've already mentioned it, but these people led to the development of Ngbs, national governing bodies. Excellent example, the FA in 1863 in Cambridge. That led to the codification. I'll just sort of squeeze it in over here. The codification of sports. And finally, I want to sort of talk about, I'll just find a little bit of space up here. I want to talk about the changing role of women. Women gradually became more sporting over this period of time. We'll talk about a couple of those things in a second. And finally, I'll squeeze it in down the bottom somewhere. We've got the move towards amateur versus professional in lots of sporting contexts. Now, that didn't tend to happen in sports like football, but in sports like rugby, in sports like athletics, which we'll come to in a second, people were either amateur or professional, and these got separated into class structures. So amateur people would tend to be middle class people, and professional people would tend to be, well, this is in sporting performance, by the way, professional people would tend to be those working class individuals. Now, with all that sort of understood as a backdrop, I want us to go right back up here. And I'm going to go through this reasonably quickly, folks, because ultimately, let's be clear about this. It's your job to learn this timeline. Look, I mean, ultimately, I can't force this into your mind. You're going to have to study this. But let's just go through, for example, association football. So we've got our growth of public schools where football versions were popular. We're particularly talking about, a period of time that would be sort of like earlier than 1850 here. So pre-1850, lots of different football versions being played in public schools. We had the canvas in, I think it was Winchester. We had the wall game at Eton. Rugby was developing at rugby school, for example. The growth of middle class led to more boys at public schools. So effectively, middle class boys grew the numbers of boys in public schools, and they actually developed a whole other type of school to be filled up by them. We called them Philistine schools, it doesn't matter here. By 1823, there's the belief that this William Webb Ellis picked up the rugby ball at rugby school, and that was the birth of rugby as a game. Now, if you want to study the development of rugby at rugby school, there's some remarkable conditions there. The fact they had a house system, the fact that they had this kind of cloistered grass area which was about the size of a rugby pitch, surrounded on all four sides by buildings, almost like a natural stadium. And they developed this game of rugby, which of course was called rugby. By 1824, we've got the first football club in Edinburgh. Scotland was extremely prolific in football in the early days, by the way. By 1845, we've got the rules of rugby established where? At rugby school. So we've got this sort of notion now, going back to what we said way down here, we've got this notion of codification. Now, it wasn't official by this point, but the rules were established by this point, okay? 1848, the Cambridge Rules established. These Cambridge Rules, just to be clear, this was for soccer. Now, you're going to say to me, oh, soccer is an American word. Soccer is absolutely an English public school word. It comes from soc of association, and football. So soccer is a British word, whatever anyone tells you. By 1857, we have a new version of rules called the Sheffield Rules formed. This was based more around the working class game of football. And by 1863, the FA was formed where? In Cambridge, in that esteemed university location by ex-public school boys and Cambridge University students, and they formed the sport, including the formation of the FA Cup. By 1872, England and Scotland played their first international. That's the first ever football international. By 1871, we got the RFU, the Rugby Football Union, is formed. Remember, we would consider rugby and football as the origin of the same sport. We then get the schism in rugby in 1895. This means, in essence, we get this professional and amateur. We got union is amateur, and we've got league. That's rugby league, by the way, as pro. Now, you folks are too young to remember. I mean, the teachers in the room, certainly I remember. I remember where rugby union was amateur, and these sports were big rivals of one another. And people would move from one version of league to union. Often it was the other way for the money. Back in the, what would it be? Certainly in the 80s and 90s. I can't remember when the exact date where professionalisation took place, but I think it was the early 2000s, late 90s. Anyway, that was our upbringing. That was normal. So we got this notion of the schism, the separation. We got the FA formed by ex-university students who used their business skills to codify. So just going back to here, the middle class codified and formed the governing body. We got the establishment of the FA Cup, a national competition allowed to happen by the development of transport and railways. We got factory owners setting up Arsenal and West Ham, as I said before, examples, factory teams to even sort of emphasise their capacity. We got the church, the clergy providing land. We got the church establishing sport teams like Aston Villa. Philanthropists, these are people that provided their wealth and money to support people with less. They paid for things like public parks and spaces where people could play. Broken time payments is a beautiful concept. This is where factory owners would allow some of their workers, despite them not being at work, to train in, let's say, their football, in this case football, and then become kind of symbols and figureheads for the workforce. And they were called broken time payments. And it was one of the ways that working class people could achieve reputation, even more money, and those broken time payments enabled that. In other words, they could work and be a sports person. We've got time set aside for workers to train play. Think about factory owners doing that, allowing their team to actually train while they're being paid. Hang on. Sip my tea there at that point. We've got codification, meant teams could travel and play a unified game. Before the unified version of games, are you aware, for example, that schools would play each other? In the first half, they'd play one version of one school's rules, and in the second half, they'd play the version of the other schools. They were unified. We get increased competitiveness via the FA Cup, so we've got this sort of notion, the FA Cup bringing a better stance to the game. Football pitches become more available in cities. We get the growth in spectatorship. Don't underestimate, for example, the importance of the railway network in achieving that, especially for away trips. We've got the notion of the Saturday half days. These came about through what we call factory acts, and they were gradual and they happened towards the end of the 19th century, but it basically meant that on Saturdays people finished by lunchtime. That allowed the 3 o'clock kick-off type opportunity. Football became an expression of the new local identity. Why do you think people are so in love with their Liverpool, their Man United, their Chelsea, or whatever it happens to be? Why do you think, I'm not a Forest fan, why do you think it's such a close, just to be clear, I'm a Carlisle, Wrexham and Nottingham Forest fan because I lived in all those towns as a young person. So that's why people that this is why this sort of sport, especially football, as local identity, people singing and chanting ritualistic behaviour, we still see it today, even though a bit more globalised. We've got here before communications and media, the Bells Weekly. There's another one called Sports Weekly, another good one to know. And we've got technology led to the improvement in stadia, so actually, being able to go and stand in covered areas where you weren't going to get rained on all the time. And we've got increased law and order, made greater public safety. Now, what I'll do there is I'll just take a brief break. I just want to sip my tea a second, and then we'll move on with our lawn tennis. But the point I want to make here, can you now see, going through that football experience, how those general characteristics which I scribbled on the screen earlier, all of a sudden they are playing out in our football, and that's exactly what we want to come to. So just give me a second just to have a briefest of pauses. So I think we're in decent shape here. So let's look at lawn tennis 1780 to 1900. And it's worth noting, by the way, that lawn tennis only existed in the last sort of period of this. I think it was, I want to say 1880s that Sphäresteig, it might be 1870s that Sphäresteig, the first version of tennis, was actually developed. But of course it was based on the real tennis. One of the things that the middle class did a lot, they behaved with what we call mimicry. They aspired towards the upper classes, and they effectively copied their traditions, albeit informing their own new ones. 1850, we also get the growth in public schools for girls. Now, I'm going to talk about, we could be talking here about whether it's Malvern College, Rodine, Cheltenham Ladies College, but the key thing here is that girls started attending public schools, and athleticism became relevant for girls as well. Oh, here we go, 1874, Sphäresteig, released by Major Walter Clompton Wingfield. First of all, what a name! Good, I'd love a name like that. But this geezer, He actually built a product, Sphäresteig, think draggers den. He had a bag of equipment. It was a rope. It was a bunch of rackets. It was a net that could be pulled across. It was balls. And wealthy middle-class people who were living in the suburbs of now bigger cities with walled back gardens or with grass turf, they could play this game as almost like a social ritual, and it became popular. By 1874, this new game, All England Tennis, Croquet and Club Championships. And notice, this lawn tennis would have been brand new because it was only just developed from here and the first competitions. By 1887, we get the success of Charlotte, better known as Lottie Dodd. Lottie Dodd was an absolute phenomenon of a tennis player. Think of her like the Serena Williams of her day, an absolute phenomenon. And she beat everybody. I think I'm going to say she won it 4 or 5 times. Check that. But she was an absolute beast. And basically, she kind of destroyed this notion that women had to be gentle and feminine and ladylike, and she went out there and she smashed the hell out of the ball, and amen to that. By 1888, we've got the LTA that was formed, obviously the Lawn Tennis Association. We've got tennis in the Olympics, in the first ever modern Olympics in 1896 in Athens. Interesting, a sport only 20 years old was already in the first modern Olympics when the vast majority of sports weren't. Why was it respected so much? It was respected so much because it was played by middle class people. It was respectable for women because they could wear their own dresses. They could do less physical exertion. It was played on high walled gardens which provided privacy. It was supervised. Think about this middle class Victorian notion of femininity at this point. I mean, I guess you can make your own mind up about it, but look, women didn't sweat. It wasn't seen as becoming and ladylike. Makes me think of certain royalty when I say things like that. Anyway, we've also got respectable for women here that weren't expected to be good. Okay, so it was like, I don't know how to put this to you, but when it was almost a courting ritual, and you see that here on these back gardens, and it was almost like this social ritual game where men and women were playing a mixed doubles team, and the woman was almost expected to be, oh, I missed it, Now, I'm not in any way, please don't think my daughters both play racket sports, and I've work with them constantly and smashing the hell out of a ball. So I don't believe in this madness one little bit. But the point is that tennis was actually a vehicle. It's vehicle for emancipation of women in sport. Okay, because people like Lottie Dodd actually changed this view. Anyway, let's go back to our track and field athletics same time period. I love this guy, Barclay Allardyce. He's a middle-class guy, and you see here, he completed 1,000 miles in 1,000 hours. Now, you might think, hang on a minute, walking as a pedestrianism was like race walking. You might think, hang on, that's not that good, is it, 1,000 miles in 1,000 hours? The key thing to this is he had to do 1 mile every hour for 1,000 hours. Now think about how hard that is. Unbelievable feat. And people lined the streets to come and just see this guy on his way, and it was extremely popular. Had a lot of wagering and gambling involved. In 1850, we got the development of the much Wenlock games. We'll come back to that in a second. Penny Brooks was the founder of that. Deerfoot, a Native American runner, arrives from America, obviously, and Deerfoot did this. He would do challenge races in Britain, and people would line the streets to go and watch this guy. And the whole idea is he did like a rope-a-dope style, so he was an unbelievable athlete. But what he would do is he'd sort of toy with the crowd, and he'd be in the lead, and then he'd fall behind, and then he'd catch up, and he'd always pip the other person right on the line to create a spectacle and to get people excited. By 1880, we get the formation of the Amateur Athletics Association. And we've got here that the AAC formed in 1886 an alternative, and they formed an exclusion clause. Just to be clear, this meant that no person who worked with their hands who was an artisan could compete in AAC events. So basically working class people were banned. There you go. Excluded mechanics, artisans and labourers. I mean, absolutely ridiculous. But this separation between amateur and professional we talked about before. In 1890, de Coubertin visits England. And we're going to talk about de Coubertin in a minute, but he was a French aristocrat, and he believed in sport as a vehicle for social reform. And specifically, he developed the modern Olympics by studying sport in Britain in the public schools, by going to much Wenlock, which we'll talk about in a second, and he formed the Olympic Games. There were Harrier and cross-country clubs that formed in city areas. I used to go to a Harrier club as a boy, but we had Harrier clubs, and these were effectively working class versions of copies of middle class athletic clubs, and they were called Harrier clubs. Sports days, which you've probably all taken part in, became sort of ritualistic at public schools in the summer, and we developed this notion of athletics as a festival. Track and field became an urban festival. We mean it was like an event. It was an expression of movement and athleticism, and of course it attracted huge audiences, and therefore we get lots of professional working class male athletes who would compete against always middle class. No, they wouldn't always compete against them, but middle class amateur athletes would always be middle class. Now, of course, we've now got the Wenlock Olympian Games. It was established, as we know already, in 1850 by this reformer, William Penny Brooks, realised that reform was on the palate of many, many individuals. You might have studied Elizabeth Fry in prisons, or, more generally, the Quaker movement. Well, William Penny Brooks was not a Quaker. He was a very religious guy, and he believed in the power of sport for social reform. So there we go, the reforming nature. He developed a multi-event contesting. Hang on, that's a bit like the Olympics. Medal swingers. Hang on, this was a bit like the Olympics. De Coubertin, who formed the 1896 Athens Games, visited and was really impressed with the work that was being done here in this little Shropshire town. And de Coubertin met with Brooks and shared his vision. And then de Coubertin, what did he do? He went and copied it in the 1896 Olympics. I mean, I'm not sure what Brooks would have thought about this. Presumably he was happy about it. This geezer nicked his ideas. Anyway, it's important to realise the importance of that Wenlock Olympian Games. So just to be clear, this is in Shropshire, tiny little place. If you ever get the chance to go, it's actually really lovely there. But also you might notice words like Wenlock. They were the mascots for the 2012 Olympic Games. Now what we're going to do is we're going to scroll all the way down. And what we've got here is we've got a question: analyse the effect of the public schools had on the development of athletics in the 19th century. So a couple of things. I really wanted to draw out some extra details here with you, okay? So we've got... It was based, in 1800, sport was based previously on popular recreation. We've got headmasters who were reformers. So let's just put this in here. This general picture of reformers, these headmasters at Rugby, and they used it as a vehicle for social control, and they also developed athleticism, a term we've used, with fair play at the centre. We've got the development of track and field developed from hunting, okay? So we've got athletics developing from hunting as a track and field athletics. Sixth formers controlled the games. Schools built track and field facilities and tracks. Fixtures occurred, which of course were enabled by our transport. The Wenlock Olympian Games were established. We got the 3As in 1864. We got the spread of the beyond the schools in the urban environment. We got factory owners supporting talented employees. We got lower classes running as a way to make money. We got the middle classes, the amateurs, still running in the image of God for godly pursuits and this kind of amateur notion. We've got here the exclusion of working class by the AAA. We've got eventually the removal of the exclusion clause, so all competed together, but we've got the reality that women remained exclusive. Can I just mention, in the Olympics, women were not allowed in the stadium. So never mind competing, but they weren't even allowed in the stadium. Okay, so let's not think that this was an egalitarian type structure, but lots of really relevant information here about the effect, in this case specifically the public schools. But look at this wording of athletics in the 19th century. So yes, we need to know our timeline, but we've got to be able to link this to other factors that we're studying as well. Second question here: the transport revolution assisted in the development of rationalisation of association football. By the way, can I talk about rationalisation? Here, there's a couple of things. We're talking about the development of rules, but we're also talking about the development of values in what we call rationalisation to form rational sport in post-industrial Britain. Explain 4 of the factors that help with this rationalisation of association football. So we've got the Factory Acts led to better conditions such as Saturday half day. We talked about that before. When we've got the notion of football teams. This is a nice point. To reduce absenteeism is actually a motivational tactic. Factory teams would compete against one another. We've got the development of industrial patronage, a really great term for you to include in your answers, industrial patronage. This is really the idea of sponsorship from the factory owner, whether it's to do with providing kit, time off, space, playing area. We've got strict rules and developed through codified sports. The business skills of the middle class were the things that ultimately provided those things. And we've got competitions like the FA Cup to be established. So again, our timeline provides us with our answer. Okay, definite need for a break there, and we're going to have a very short section afterwards about Sport England and the local and national partners. And we are back. I'm just going to sip a bit of water, and I want to see if Martha's got any questions for me.
Yes, I've got a couple of questions. First question, James, for a 3-marker on industrial life, how many points would you say we need to aim for full marks?
Okay, so a couple of things to look out for. If a question ever says to you, identify 3, give 3 advantages of, state 3 things, then what's going to happen in situations like that is that your first 3 answers are going to be marked, and then they won't mark any further. So if the number of marks is named, make sure that you name your strongest 3 answers in that case. However, in general, if you get a 3-mark question or a 4, whatever it happens to be, you should apply what I quite sillily refer to as the principle of the bogey. Okay, and if you play or have any awareness of golf, you'll know that bogey is 1 over par. And that means that if you've got a 3-mark question, you're looking to make 4 really good points. The other part of 4-mark question, make 5 really good points. But the other part of this is to identify what the command term is asking you to do, because very often it might be sort of it could say identify and explain something for 3 marks. So you get 1 mark for saying what it is, and then a couple more marks for explaining that thing. If you're asked to explain, evaluate, compare, it's that skill specifically which is going to get you the credit. Analyze, of course, is the classic example in AQA A-Level where you're asked to break something into parts and then explain those components. So I think that's the key thing. But I would say in general terms, you want to apply that principle of bogey, 1 over for every single time. The only time that doesn't apply is the level questions, where you obviously want to embrace all of your knowledge to answer that particular question.
Brilliant. And James, another question. What was it like to be an amateur sports person in the 19th century? How different was it from being an amateur nowadays? Okay,
so very different. So first of all, an amateur would have been universally a middle class person in the 19th century. And what we refer to as an amateur or a gentleman amateur in the 19th century, we're talking about someone who not only didn't compete for money, but participated in sport for very, very specific reasons. So because they felt it was godly, because they wanted to challenge and test their own body, because they believed in like the cult of athleticism and health, because they've been taught that through their school experience in sort of, well-to-do, well-resourced, either Philistine or Clarendon public schools. And that's what we mean by the gentleman amateur. And to sort of encapsulate this, if you go back to the 19th century, which of course you can't, but if we read back to the 19th century, things that were involved with amateurism were things like people would not train. Training would be seen like doping today. Training was outside of the code, the ethic of what sport was meant to be. You've also got sort of the notion that you played with a very, very strict moral code. And a classic example of this is that there were football teams, particularly a team that were called the Corinthian Casuals, who would refuse to take a free kick or a penalty if the opposition had been called by a referee that a foul had been made, because they refused to believe that a gentleman could be capable of foul play. The two things did not exist in one person simultaneously. So very, very different today. Today we think about amateur almost like, well, someone who's not very good at sport, or is good at sport but decided to go to university and work in a bank or whatever. They're an amateur. But at this time, the prestige, more elite people in our society were the amateurs, and they chose this lifestyle partly because they didn't have to get paid. They were doing fine. They were working in commerce or industry or whatever else it happens to be. But that's what we mean by the amateur in the 19th century. Quite different today. There were quite a few shamateurs though. And guess what a shamateur was? A shamateur was a person that said, it presented as an amateur, very well to do, very middle class, and they, of course, they were on the old Wonga, weren't they? So there's quite a few of them and all.
Mm-hmm. So was it that to rig bets and stuff?
Yeah,
like
I think rigged bets, but it was more important. More than anything, was like people developed like a sort of a level of fame in their participation, in their performance. Of course, they ultimately demanded like an appearance fee. A great example is that guy Deerfoot, okay, Native American. He was making a fortune by racing against middle class gentlemen, amateur men in these sort of exhibition races. So yeah, I mean, probably the greatest shamateur of all was W.G. Grace, who was a cricketer who scored many runs. He was an amateur but got paid handsomely behind closed doors. So what can you do? Any more questions, Marta?
No more questions at the moment.
Okay, good stuff. So look, folks, we've got a really, as I said before, dinky little session here for part 2. This will go no longer than 10 minutes, I would imagine. So let's do this. There's a little bit of detail. I really have focused in this section on the accuracy of the language. So I know sometimes it can feel a bit tedious with this kind of topic, but folks, if you learn what's on these notes and what I'm going to go through with you here, you really are going to be well equipped to answer questions on this, so please do that, okay, because it really will be worthwhile. Okay, let's move us on to the canvas. This should work. Here we go. It's worth remembering that this organisation, Sport England, didn't actually exist before the National Lottery, and before that time, sports organisation structure and admin in the UK was absolutely amateur. It had no centralised structures. It was almost done accidentally. Sport England and also UK Sport, which we could look at in another session, are really central to that. And one of the things they did is they sort of built relationships with local and national partners in order to make sport a more professional, organised structure. So let's first of all look at our relationship between Sport England and local partnerships. And the key thing here is we want to look at our CSPs, our county sports partnerships, which of course are there to provide sporting opportunities on the ground that are relevant in the actual locality in which they've been participating. What are the role of these county sports partnerships? Well, first of all, they receive their funding via the National Lottery, via Sport England, by the way. They distribute what's called sport premium money, which is guaranteed central government money to provide sporting opportunities for young people in the local area. The whole idea of it is to develop this sporting habit. Now, we can call this PL, or physical literacy. A strong part of physical literacy is the tendency to be lifelong active and to value activity as part of one's life. Therefore, we've got more opportunities for young people to play sport. Now, we're looking at this from a sport perspective, but of course this could be physical activity, more general, more open, but certainly to play sport. We're looking at the nurturing or the development of talent coming through because it's been identified early, because these opportunities have been put in place. So these CSPs via Sport England or working with Sport England are able to identify, nurture and build anyone that's showing good quality sporting prowess. Right facilities in the right places. Now this could be very, very different from one area to another, right? It could be really specific and unique. They would support local authorities, so of course not just reliant on a local council to provide sort of leisure centre and sporting opportunities, but the county sports partner work alongside them to actually identify that. They're able to unlock local funding, so help organisations to actually source funding to whether it's to develop a club or a facility, whatever it happens to be. They would therefore develop opportunities within communities for different individuals in the communities, and they'd support club development. Their services to do this are the following things. They will train coaches and volunteers, absolutely crucial. They'll develop education programs, these CSPs. They'll run initiatives. They'll ensure there's equality. They'll improve facilities. They'll provide access to funding. They'll provide training and support around safeguarding and protecting, especially young people. And they'll provide a network between different sports to see that sort of the notion of what success looks like and to spread that from one sport to another. Now, this is a real possible question for you folks. It's that relationship between Sport England and the county sports partnership in this case. Now, we strongly believe that what's on the, I guess, table here is the source and the basis of what your answer is going to be. Now, the other thing we want to do here is we want to be aware of national partners. I mean, it's very listy, if I can put it that way, not the composer. It's very listy, but what we've got here is that Sport England works with a lot of national partners as well. So we've got the Youth Sport Trust, which is sport at grassroots levels and especially in schools. All schools, but they tend to do a lot of work in primaries especially. They work with the Activity Alliance, and this is really relevant with regard to what you might call Paralympic sport. I don't mean necessarily the championships, but people who are experiencing disability having the opportunity to experience inclusive or adaptive sport. I really like those terms, inclusive or adapted sports, and bringing those to people and making sure people who are experiencing disabilities have access to something that they're interested in. Sporting Equals is a national partner, and you'll see here this is about black and ethnic minority population and making sure that individuals, regardless of background, ethnicity have an opportunity of equity in sporting opportunity. We've got an organisation called Women in Sport. It kind of does what it says on the tin, right? They're breaking down barriers for female involvement in sport. You know, we know that there's barriers there. We know that there's esteem issues there. We know that there's fewer role models. We know that there's less media coverage. We know that there's potential for stereotyping of women who are muscular, physical, and Women in Sport is an organisation looking to challenge that. We've got an organisation called Street Games. This is the idea of disadvantaged communities and bringing sport, making it more accessible of all. Think about how many sports have cost involved. Okay, maybe not so much athletics, maybe not so much football, but anything outside of that. And you're looking at swimming, it's expensive. You're looking at, I'm not saying we do swimming as a street game, by the way, but you're looking at rugby, you're looking at golf, you're looking at cricket. These are all expensive opportunities. So by bringing them to communities and making it affordable or free, that's the role of street games. We've got other general initiatives. Now, these are all slightly different, and you'll have heard of some of these. Places People Play, providing opportunities. Inclusive sport, we've covered a lot of that. Get Equipped, providing equipment to those that haven't got access to it. And This Girl Can, a very, very successful movement, which has challenged the notion of, I suppose, what you might call female incapacity to perform like males in certain areas of sport, right? It's really challenged that successfully. And of course, the other national partner, the Ngbs, whether it's the Football Association, the Rugby Football Association, whether it's the LTA, whether it's Badminton England or whatever, they help develop sporting opportunities for all. And I just want to give one more detail about Ngbs. All of them have to develop what we call WSPs. These are called whole sport plans. And Sport England works with these organisations to develop these whole sport plans, which are about provision from the very foundation grassroots tier up to the very elite level. And effectively, Ngbs are judged on their capacity to deliver that WSP, and Sport England works with them as a partner in order to achieve that. Now, let's look at some questions before we finish off. The English Federation of Disability Sport is one national partner of Sport England. State two others. We've got two organisations here. We've got SportsAid, we've got UK Sport, but notice you've got all of these. We've looked at the majority of these. I've just thrown two additional ones in there for you to add to your list. Okay, so make sure you've got SportsAid and UK Sport. By the way, just to clarify, SportAid provide small quantities of money for up-and-coming athletes. Okay, so someone who is a good quality athlete can get sort of support with their travel expenses. And UK Sport, this is for elite sport provision. Okay, so there's just a little bit of extra detail on those national initiatives we've got there. Sport England invests in 49 county sports partnerships. Explain how services provided by these partners allow Sport England to develop sport locally. So we've got development of quality of club sport. We've got people can participate in greater numbers. We've got coach development. We've got increased standards of performance. We've got facilities being invested in. More people at grassroots participation. We've got safeguarding. We've got safe environments, and we've got volunteer development. If we go back up to here, that's the information that we've taken from here and we've included in our answer. So nice and simple, nice and clean, absolutely robust information for you there, folks. And we know there's going to be questions on this, so it's imperative that you're able to reproduce the quality of the information in that table and that spider in the answers when those questions are posed to you. And there we have it, a bit more water. Marta, any questions?
Yes, there are a few questions. First question. By the way, well, I have an apology to make as well. Some questions have come in earlier, but the list didn't refresh on time, so didn't see them. So your question might make an appearance now. First question, you have gone into lots of details, especially in the timeline. When looking at past exam questions, the mark schemes never have gone into this much depth. Do you recommend learning it all?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I do. And just to be clear on that one, folks, the majority of the topics we've gone over this afternoon, this evening, have not yet been examined by AQA, so we don't know the depth that they're going to go into, hence making sure it's deep enough. The way I always see it is my responsibility to you as the student, my responsibility is to cover that last mark on every mark scheme. That, you know, that one that you kind of surprises you, why is that there? I want to make sure that I cover that and you have the opportunity. I'd also like to say something general about needing to learn something. Reflect on that phrase, reflect what that means. I want you to want to learn this. I want you to want to know it. And I want you, in my opinion, you deserve to know that and you deserve to understand that, and hence me trying to teach you as robustly and thoroughly as possible. What I don't want any impression of whatsoever, this is what we've just gone over there, is not absolutely robustly exam board specific or AQA. Absolutely is, folks. Every single word of it. So yeah.
Brilliant. Another question, do we need to know the exact dates for stages of development for sport?
Yeah, I could say the same thing about needing to know, but the general answer to that would be you will not be penalised for not knowing that the FA was formed in 1863 in Cambridge, for example. That will not penalise you. But obviously, if you can't name the national governing body of the FA, that might. Okay, so yeah, but again, I would come back to the same point. If you know it, include it. And I know it, so I include it for you. And it also, the dates give context because you see the order in which things actually happen. Think about the development in 1850 of the Wenlock Olympian Games, and then the visit of de Coubertin some years, a few decades later, then engaging with that connection of those dates is important. So that for context actually helps us.
Brilliant. Another question. For the sport England part of the topic, is it similar answers to the Ngbs part of the A2 knowledge of sport and society?
No, I wouldn't want to. I'd have to check the exact comparison. I mean, I could probably have that document, if you give me a moment. I could probably have that document in front of us for Ngbs if you want me to. I didn't have that open at the moment. Just give me 1 second. Is there another question while I just retrieve that, Marta?
Yes, a student's saying that surely the advanced information that's provided by exam boards is fairly useless because synoptic links can be drawn from anything, from any topic, any area of the course. But do you think it is useless, not useless? Should students know everything? What's your view on this?
Yes, you definitely should know everything. I really wouldn't want anyone to get the wrong end of the stick and think that we are advocating in these sessions that you should be only learning the AEI. That absolutely is not the case. Obviously, when we put revision sessions on in normal years, we select series of information that we're going to present, and we do that off the trends of the paper. Things that are examined commonly, things that have not been examined for a while, we'll choose those because it's a decent bet they might present themselves. This year, the thing we know for a fact that's going to be on the exam is the AEI material, hence that we're actually focusing on the AEI, because it's guaranteed if you develop in those areas that you're going to get credit and marks in those areas. So that's why we've selected that. It is in absolutely no way an attempt to suggest to you that you should only learn this. Any educator that suggests that to a young person, I would have serious words with. You deserve and have the right to learn the entirety of the material. Okay, we happen to focus on this specific stuff in this, 45 minutes, 1 hour revision, because we know it's going to appear on the paper. Want to know it, want to understand it. That, in my opinion, is far more important. But you definitely need to learn it all. Please don't walk into that exam without doing that. That would be a really bad idea. I would say learn everything and overlearn this. Overlearn, of course, is a skill acquisition term. We looked at it yesterday, right? Overlearn, hone these, and learn everything.
Okay.
It's like a table tennis player overlearning a serve because it's such a crucial shot, right? Same principle, but you have to be able to play all shots, of course. Table tennis again.
Brilliant. Yes, you were looking.
I'm just trying to find. I wasn't. I didn't have this prepped, so I Let me just see if I can actually find what I'm looking for here. I can't, so I'm gonna reserve answer on that question, and I'll actually, so stuff on the Ngbs I'll happily send around to people who've signed up for this, or to teachers signed up for this.
Okay.
But just to be clear, the information I went over there for the local and the national partners are specific to the county sports partnerships and to the obviously the other partners and initiatives nationally. That's the focus of that particular content and where we want you to be answering. And with that in mind, I'll just remind you of the reasons we've done that. Just bear with me a second as I find this. Let me just share. Oh, I don't have a share. Sorry, I've not done this particularly well. Just bear with me, folks. I'm sorry. If you want to leave us, feel free. But I just want to make sure that I'm going to show you this. Let me put my microphone onto there. Okay, so let me show you this now. The material, obviously, that we've just covered there, we've covered here. We've covered this material here, which is the interrelationship. Is the characteristics of 1780 to 1900, limited to those 3 activities in the Wenlock Olympian Games, and we've just covered this specific area here. So everything that's required in those 2 areas we have just covered, and you've got now absolutely exceptional notes for that material. I've not attempted to cover anything further from the specification. And the comment was made before about synoptic links. Of course you can link this to other parts of the course. I was doing that within the teaching as we went. But yeah, that's how it answers that one.
Brilliant. Then we also have a request from a student who's asking if you could identify the AO1s, AO2s and AO3 points when you're going through the model long answer.
Yeah, so the way to do that, folks, so obviously when you see it on the screen, I've not included the mark scheme there. All the AO1, 2s and 3s are there in the mark scheme, so get that document. It's available to you on the hub page if you haven't printed out. All the AO1s, 2s and 3s are all referenced in there, so please do go through that. That's sort of a chunk really, so get your head down, get into that and make some comparisons between my model answers and which AO1s, 2s and 3s were picked up in those particular answers. So that's exactly what that document is, what the purpose of that document is.
Mm-hmm. And one final question from another student. What would you say the most effective way of revising in these last weeks leading up to the exams is? How long's a piece of string?
No, I would say, if I can be so bold, just let me, another thing I just want to quickly get for you. I would suggest that the best way, I'm going to just make an assumption here that effectively your subject knowledge is good, or it's developing, or it's growing. I would say the best thing you can do, and if you haven't got this, we can provide this for you. I just want to show you this, just remind you of infographics. The best thing that you could do would be to work on the analyze skill and the evaluate skill for AQA A-Level, and to do so with 8 and 15 markers, but also for 4s and 3s. That is by far the best thing you can do to prepare yourself for your assessment. And if you are short of questions, and let's be honest, you are, because you've got the fact that AQA just haven't published that many questions because there haven't been that many exams. That is exactly why we made our exam simulator. We have got hundreds of questions in there for AQA A-Level of exactly that nature. And just to remind teachers, if you want your students to be using that in the final days, then before this you can use it freely with a 28-day free trial. So to come and jump on that. We're not after your money, okay? If you want to work with us commercially in the future, do it. But that's not what this is about. It's about helping these young people in the meantime. So I would suggest, assuming your knowledge level is good, in my opinion, that would be the best form of practice you could do.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant.
Cool. Anything further, Marty?
Nothing else.
No. Well, Martin and I, we've just done a back-to-back double-header OCR A-Level Biomechanics AQA Sport Society. The difference could not be greater. And we're going to go and have, I think it's sausage and mash, Martin. I think that's what I'm aware is cooking there in the kitchen. A bit of sausage mash, a bit of onion gravy. Yeah. And then I am going to treat you this evening. You know how much I care, the love I hold for you, the respect, the passion I have for you. Tonight, Villa, Liverpool. What do you think?
Can't wait.
I might even open a couple of bottles of Baby Sham. All right, you will have a great night here. Brilliant. Cheers, everyone. Have a great afternoon. Have a great evening. We appreciate you very much for being here. Take care. Oh, sorry, I completely forgot. Next week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, 4 back-to-back sessions. I've got them here. We're doing X-Phys on Monday. We're doing Sports Psych on Tuesday. We're doing Biomech on Wednesday. And then we're doing the very final one, Sports Science and Technology. What else could you do with a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday even, but hang around with us. Cheers. Have a good one. Bye.